My name is Elena Maris Lawson, 38 years old. I did not expect the courtroom to go silent the moment I walked in, but it did, as if someone had reached up and turned the volume knob on life all the way down. Conversations cut off mid-sentence, pens froze above legal pads, and almost 40 pairs of eyes swung toward me at once. Some looked merely curious, some narrowed and judgmental, and two pairs, the ones I knew best, were openly mocking. My parents were seated at the plaintiff's table like they were starring in a show only they had auditioned for, their mouths already pulled into the tired, familiar smirks they used whenever I dared to exist inconveniently in their world. Their attorney, a tall man in a navy suit with the polished arrogance of someone who had never missed a mortgage payment in his life, rifled through his notes with a smug ease that said he already believed today was just a formality on the road to victory. I felt the weight of my own steps as I approached the defendant's table, each heel strike echoing in the tiled space, a hollow, measured sound. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the air tasted faintly of stale coffee and old paper, and behind it all was the quiet, relentless awareness that everything my grandmother had spent a lifetime building and everything I had become was balanced on the edge of this one day. I had told myself I was ready. I had repeated it so many times it almost sounded true, but when the judge entered, robe swaying, expression carved out of long years and harder decisions, and his gaze landed on me, something shifted. He froze for a fraction of a second. His eyebrows lifted. He leaned forward, squinting as though he were seeing a ghost or a name resurfacing from an old file. "Wait," he said, voice cutting through the hush. "You're Jag, ma'am." Across the room, my parents' attorney went visibly pale, my mother's lips parted, my father's hand clenched around the edge of the table, and in that tiny, suspended moment, with their smirks dissolving and the judge's tone turning more cautious, I felt a strange, unwelcome clarity slide into place. 38 years of being unwanted, overlooked, half-remembered, and easily dismissed had led me to this exact suffocating point. The day my parents dragged me into court to strip away the $4.7 million inheritance my grandmother had left me, the inheritance they believed should have been theirs all along. To understand how we ended up here, you have to go back to where it really started, long before military uniforms and courtrooms and headlines. Back to Maple Falls, the small Midwestern town where the summers smelled like fresh-cut grass and cheap sunscreen, and winters meant waking up before dawn just to carve a path through snow thick enough to swallow your boots. There was one diner, 3 churches, and too many people who all knew each other's business. Life there wasn't glamorous. It was ordinary in the way that can feel suffocating when you're young and nostalgic when you're older. My biological parents, Daniel and Linda Lawson, had been Maple Falls' golden couple. He was the handsome former high school quarterback, the kind of guy whose Letterman jacket had once lived rent-free in every girl's imagination. She was the bright-smiled cheerleader, with a razor-edged tongue she kept mostly hidden from adults. They married young, hot with passion and promise, both of them convinced they were destined for something bigger than a sleepy town and a modest house. Then I arrived. I don't think they hated me. Not exactly. I was more like a complication, an accidental detour from the life they'd sketched in bold lines. I was the crying baby that made late nights harder, the extra mouth that made thin budgets tighter, the uninvited witness to their constant arguments about money, missed chances, and all the glittering things they felt they deserved. When I was barely 2 years old, they dropped me off at my grandmother's house for a little while, so they could, as they put it, get back on their feet. They kissed my forehead, told my grandmother they'd be back soon, and drove away. They never came back. My grandmother, Margaret Lawson, did not look like anyone's idea of a millionaire. She wore soft, fading cardigans and sensible shoes, baked blueberry muffins on Sundays, and spoke in a calm, steady voice that could slice through panic without ever rising in volume. Her wealth came from 3 small hardware stores she had built up over decades, and the unflashy rental properties she bought when other people were panicking and selling. Maple Falls called her the Quiet Millionaire, and the nickname suited her. When I was 5, I thought she was some kind of witch who could summon safety. By 10, I knew she was the only person on earth who truly loved me. By 15, I wanted to become exactly who she was: steady, kind, fair, and impossible to shake. She never once badmouthed my parents. Not when they forgot my birthdays, not when they missed Christmas, not even when they drifted back into town every few years, all fake smiles and tight hugs, asking about my life for 10 minutes before casually steering the conversation toward how things were a little tight right now, and maybe she could help them out just this one time. Grandma always refused without cruelty. She'd pat my hand and say, "Some people grow in one direction, some in another. You can't force a crooked tree to stand straight, sweetheart." I didn't fully understand it then. I just knew her gaze always softened when she looked at me, and hardened just a little when she looked at them. She was the one who accidentally introduced me to the world of law. She often attended county meetings, probate hearings, or landlord-tenant sessions for her properties and came home with stories. She'd sit at the kitchen table, glasses low on her nose, and tell me about brothers who hadn't spoken in years, fighting over a strip of land, neighbors tearing each other apart over a fence line they didn't even want, or families torn to shreds in courtrooms over wills and inheritances that should have been acts of love instead of weapons. "Money doesn't change who you are," she'd say, tapping a finger against the table. "It just turns the lights on so everyone can see it clearly." Sometimes she'd let me sit beside her while she reviewed contracts and tenant agreements. I loved the crisp feel of the paper, the neat black lines of clauses and signatures, the way rules lay there in ink, unbothered by mood swings or manipulation. In a world where my parents floated in and out, the law felt grounded, solid, something that didn't run when things got hard. While other kids spent Saturdays watching cartoons, I swept aisles in the hardware store, wiped down shelves, learned how to count inventory and balance a ledger. Grandma never called it work. She called it practice. "You never know when life will ask you to stand on your own 2 feet," she'd say, handing me a broom. "Better to learn early." I wasn't the popular girl in high school. I wasn't the funny one or the athletic one either. I was the grandma girl, the one teachers trusted to return change correctly, the one neighbors knew by name because I bagged their nails and paint cans with a smile that looked a lot like my grandmother's. I studied hard, not because anyone pushed me, but because I wanted to honor what she had given up to keep me. The future was something I thought about in quiet moments, wondering if I'd ever do anything big enough to feel worthy of her pride. Then one day, a Navy recruiter came to our school. Most of my classmates saw his presentation as an excuse to zone out. I did too, at first, until he mentioned 4 words that made every nerve in my body sit up straight. "You can serve as lawyers," he said, pacing in front of the projector screen. "It's called JAG, Judge Advocate General. You can stand in real courtrooms, defend sailors, prosecute crimes, and make a difference." Something clicked. Suddenly, all of Grandma's courthouse stories, all those evenings spent reading contracts beside the hum of the refrigerator, every ledger and receipt snapped into focus. The law wasn't just something that happened to people. It was something you could wield, something you could use to shield the ones who had no one else. I went home buzzing with possibility and spilled every detail at the kitchen counter while Grandma stirred a pot of vegetable soup. She listened without interrupting, her wooden spoon moving in slow circles, steam fogging the window behind her. When I finally ran out of breath, she turned, dried her hands on a towel, and studied my face for a long moment. "If that's where your heart points, I'll walk beside you as far as these old legs can go," she said. There was pride in her eyes, but also something heavier, a knowledge that choosing a life of justice meant choosing a life that sometimes hurt. She helped me through entrance exams, interviews, and paperwork that felt endless. She bought me a pocket copy of the Constitution and slid it into my backpack with a wink. When the acceptance letter arrived, congratulating me on being commissioned into the United States Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps, she cried like someone had handed her a second lifetime. My parents, somewhere out there, sent a text that read, "Congrats, do well." I stared at the screen for a long time, then put the phone face down and walked back into the kitchen where Grandma was already ironing my soon-to-be uniform shirt with reverent care. At my commissioning ceremony, she was the shortest person in the row of proud family members, lost among pressed suits and camera flashes, but she stood the tallest in my heart. When I raised my right hand and swore my oath, Her eyes shone with something fierce and unshakable. Afterward, she hugged me so hard my nameplate dug into her shoulder. "You're going to make the world a fairer place," she whispered. I believed her. I built my whole life around that belief. Years later, after deployments, late nights in cramped legal offices, and countless sailors whose stories blurred together into a mosaic of broken rules and second chances, I thought I understood what justice looked like. I thought I knew what it meant to defend the vulnerable and challenge the greedy. I had no idea that one day, the people I would have to stand against, in a courtroom just like the ones I worked in, would be the ones who had once dropped me off with a promise to come back. And now, sitting at the defendant's table under the judge's steady gaze, with my parents watching me like a stranger who had stolen their birthright, I realized that every story Grandma ever told me about wills and families and money had just become my own. The weeks that followed, the courtroom's cold silence felt like falling into a story I didn't remember agreeing to be part of. I had stood there in front of the judge, wearing a calm I didn't entirely feel, while my parents and their attorney looked at me as if I were an obstacle instead of their daughter. But the truth was, this fight hadn't started in that courtroom. It had begun long before, years earlier, in the quiet spaces of my life, where loss and loyalty intertwined so tightly I couldn't separate them. And as soon as the gavel dropped that morning, the memories began pulling me backward toward the moment everything truly changed, the day my grandmother died. I had been stationed in Norfolk then, sitting alone in my small apartment reviewing case files under the washed-out glow of a winter sunset. The heater rattled in the corner, trying and failing to chase away the cold creeping under the windows. I remember shifting a stack of reports aside when my phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed the name of the care nurse from Maple Falls. Something inside me stilled, quieting every other sound in the room. "Miss Lawson," the nurse said softly, her voice warm but strained. "I'm so sorry. Your grandmother passed peacefully this morning." For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't think past the sudden pressure in my chest. It felt like the world had pressed pause, holding me suspended between disbelief and pain. The nurse kept talking, gentle, patient, telling me there had been no suffering, that she had been comfortable, but all I could hear were fragments of words slipping past each other like smoke. I remember gripping the edge of my desk, knuckles white, as if the furniture could keep me upright while everything else fell apart. I flew home the next morning, limped, really. Grief is strange that way. It slows your feet even when you're running. At the Maple Falls airport, everything looked the same as always. The peeling blue paint on the walls, the weak hum of the old speaker system, the line of rental cars covered in frost. Everything unchanged, except she was no longer there waiting for me. But someone else was. Standing on the curb by the pickup zone were my parents, Daniel and Linda Lawson, looking impatient, as if I were the one who'd kept them waiting. My father wore a stylish coat that didn't match the man I remembered, and my mother held a latte, like she was posing for a magazine cover. Their eyes skimmed over my uniform, noting the insignia, the ribbons, the precision of it all, but neither of them smiled. "Well," my mother said, "the Navy girl finally arrived." Not a word about the woman we'd lost. Not a single acknowledgement of the grief pressing down on my chest. Just a brittle voice cracking the winter air. "We figured we should handle arrangements," my father added, his tone flat, dismissive. "Arrangements. Not mourning, not remembering. Arrangements." The drive to Grandma's house was suffocating. I sat in the back seat, staring at streets that once felt safe and familiar but now looked washed out, colorless. Her porch chimes jingled when we pulled in, but without her behind that door, the sound felt hollow. Inside, my parents wandered around like tourists in a museum they didn't care about. They touched picture frames they hadn't earned, opened in drawers they never used, picked up her belongings with a kind of proprietary curiosity that made my stomach twist. They didn't cry. They didn't pause. They didn't even sit down. Then, 2 days later, we met with attorney Harold Peters. His office smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books, the kind of place where respect still meant something. He looked at me with gentle sadness, but when he turned to my parents, the warmth faded into something more reserved. He opened the folder that held my grandmother's will. I could hear the paper shift, crisp and final. "To my granddaughter, Elena Maris Lawson," he read, "I leave my home, my properties, my shares, and my financial accounts totaling $4.7 million. My parents visibly stiffened. My mother gasped like someone had slapped her. My father's face flushed an angry red. To my son Daniel and his wife Linda, I leave my love and the hope that one day they understand a legacy is built on character, not greed. My mother slammed her palm against the desk. She was manipulated, she snapped. She wasn't herself. My father pointed at me. She used her military background to pressure an old woman. I said nothing, not because I was calm, but because grief had drained the strength from every word I might have used to defend myself. Attorney Peters closed the folder gently and said, "Her will is legally sound. She had full capacity." But they didn't care. They stormed out, declaring they would contest it. Their anger was a wave crashing through the room, leaving nothing but debris behind. And 1 week later, on the cold morning we buried her, I was handed court papers at her graveside, accused of manipulation, accused of fraud, accused by the same people who had left me behind decades ago. Neighbors whispered. Headlines twisted the truth. The Navy placed me on administrative leave while they reviewed the case. At night, I slept in Grandma's old armchair because I couldn't bear to enter her bedroom. I'd pull one of her quilts around me and breathe in the faint scent of lavender lingering in the fabric. Her diary sat beside me on the table. One night, I opened it and found a page dated the year she changed her will. She had written, "Elena is steady, fair, and capable. Daniel has not changed. I fear his choices will bring pain to others again. I pray he finds humility before it is too late." Her words broke me open, but they also strengthened something inside me, something quiet, resolute, and fiercely loyal. I would not let her wishes be twisted. I would not let her voice be erased. So I went to Madison and found an attorney named Evelyn Howe, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a spine of steel and eyes that missed nothing. She listened carefully as I told her everything, from my earliest memories to the final moments of the will reading. When I finished, she tapped the folder lightly and said, "Your grandmother was clear, and we're going to protect that clarity." But she also asked the question I had been avoiding. "Why didn't you mention you were JAG?" I didn't answer her then. Maybe because part of me still didn't understand why it mattered. Or maybe because admitting it felt like stepping into a version of myself I wasn't sure I deserved to be. All I knew was this: my parents had chosen war, and I had no choice except to fight back. The days leading up to the hearing passed in a blur of depositions, interrogatories, and late nights reading every line of every document Grandma had ever entrusted to me. Their lawyer, Richard Gable, twisted my words, prodded my memories, and tried to paint me as a manipulative opportunist. But grief has its own kind of backbone, and I refused to bend. 2 days before the hearing, my parents barged into Grandma's house again, demanding I surrender the inheritance. When I stood firm, something inside me shifted, a final, irrevocable click. This wasn't just a legal fight, it was a reckoning. And as the hearing approached, I realized something I hadn't understood until that moment. Justice wasn't only going to test the truth of my grandmother's will, it was going to test the strength of my heart. The morning of the hearing broke gray and metallic, the kind of winter day where the sky looked like a sheet of steel hanging low over Maple Falls. I stood in front of Grandma's old bathroom mirror, the same speckled glass she'd used to fix her hair before church, and straightened the collar of my dark suit. My uniform hung in the closet, pressed and perfect, but today I wasn't here as an officer of the Navy. Not officially. At least that's what I kept trying to tell myself. On the nightstand beside me lay a small object that ruined that illusion: the gold and silver insignia pin of the Judge Advocate General's Corps. I had taken it off, placed it down, picked it back up, and put it down again so many times the metal had warmed under my fingers. I didn't want to look like I was using the Navy as a shield. I didn't want people to think I was hiding behind rank, but Grandma's voice kept echoing in my mind, gentle but firm. "Truth is a shield, sweetheart. Don't be afraid to hold it up." She had never raised me to shrink from who I was. She'd raised me to stand in it. After a long, shaky breath, I pinned the insignia to my lapel. It felt heavier than it looked, like a weight and a promise all at once. Outside, snow crunched under my boots as I walked to the car. The cold bit through my gloves, burning my lungs with every breath, but the sting was oddly grounding. Maple Falls was waking up slowly, porch lights flicking on, chimneys exhaling thin streams of smoke, the neon sign at the bakery buzzing to life. I paused at the end of Grandma's driveway and looked back at her house, at the porch where she'd stood to wave me off to bases across the country. The wind nudged the chimes hanging under the eave, and for a brief moment it sounded like her whisper, "Stand tall." The courthouse parking lot was already half full by the time I arrived. A local reporter lingered near the entrance, camera at the ready. I lowered my gaze and walked past, ignoring the itch of curiosity at my back. This wasn't a spectacle to me. This was my life, my grandmother's legacy, the story she'd never wanted to see written this way. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee, dust, and nerves. I found Evelyn waiting near the defense table, her posture straight, her notes neatly stacked. She gave me a small nod when she saw the pin on my lapel. "Good," she murmured under her breath. "Let them see who they're underestimating." Across the aisle, my parents sat with their attorney, Richard Gable. My mother wore a black coat with a dramatic faux fur collar, her expression arranged into something like grief that never quite reached her eyes. My father's jaw was locked, his hands folded tightly, eyes flicking between me and the judge's bench with a mix of resentment and anticipation. Gable had that same polished confidence I'd seen in his office during my deposition, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile a little too satisfied. To him, this wasn't a family suffering. It was a case to be won. "All rise," the bailiff called. The room rustled to its feet as Judge Michael Hanover entered. He looked exhausted in the way only long years on the bench can carve into a person. Deep lines bracketing his mouth, eyes that had seen too many people lie to them. He settled into his chair, glanced briefly at the file in front of him, then let his gaze sweep the room. When his eyes landed on me, they stopped. His brows furrowed, he leaned forward just slightly, squinting. "Excuse me," he said, the room falling even quieter. "But are you JAG, ma'am?" A ripple went through the gallery. Gable's confident posture faltered. My mother's lips parted. My father's shoulders tensed. I rose, spine straight, voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. Lieutenant Commander Elena Lawson, United States Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps." Whispers hissed softly in the room, quickly silenced by the bailiff's sharp glance. The judge's expression shifted, still neutral, but more intent. "Very well," he said. "Let's proceed." Gable recovered first. He stood with a rustle of expensive fabric and moved to the center of the room, addressing the judge with a practiced blend of concern and indignation. "Your Honor, my clients contend that their daughter, Miss Lawson, exerted undue influence over her grandmother, an elderly woman with declining mental capacity. They believe the will in question does not reflect the true intent of the deceased, but rather the manipulations of someone who stood to benefit greatly." He didn't glance at me when he said it, but I could feel the accusation pointed as a knife. "Lieutenant Commander," the judge corrected mildly, without looking away from his notes. Gable's jaw twitched. "Of course, Lieutenant Commander Lawson." He called my parents to the stand one by one. They painted a picture of a mother who had grown confused, distant, not herself, after I returned from deployment. My mother, with glistening eyes, said Grandma seemed distracted, that she would forget small things, that she started pulling away from her real family. My father claimed she grew erratic financially, that she started hiding documents, that she became strangely secretive with me. The words were hesitant in places, theatrical in others, stitched together into a story that felt almost convincing if you didn't know the woman they were talking about. The judge listened carefully, face unreadable. Evelyn sat beside me, making occasional notes, but mostly just watching, waiting. When Gable finally said, "No further questions," she rose with a calm that belied the sharpness I knew she carried. She started simply. "How often did you visit your mother in the last 10 years?" she asked my father. He shifted in the witness chair. "When we could. We were busy." "Would you say once a month?" Evelyn asked. He hesitated. "Not that often." "Once a year?" His throat bobbed. "Sometimes." "And how many times did you ask her for money during those visits?" "Objection!" Gable cut in quickly. "Relevance?" "Overruled," the judge said, eyes narrowing. "Very relevant. Answer the question, Mr. Lawson." My father's jaw clenched. "I don't recall." Evelyn didn't blink. "Would bank statements help refresh your memory?" she asked, and slid a folder onto the evidence table. From my seat, I watched my father's face drain of color as pages were flipped, as amounts were read aloud, as the pattern became undeniable. Year after year of requests, withdrawals, loans that were never repaid. My mother's composure cracked, her eyes darting around as though she could find a version of events to cling to that didn't look like this. Next, Evelyn brought the medical records and cognitive evaluations. The doctor's reports were clear. No signs of diminished capacity, consistent mental acuity, sharp as ever. Then she produced the diary. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table as I saw the worn leather cover being carried forward, the familiar blue ribbon peeking from its side. Part of me wanted to stand up and say no, to keep Grandma's private thoughts in the quiet safety of our living room. The other part knew this was the only way her voice could be heard now. "This diary," Evelyn said, "remained in Margaret Lawson's possession until her death. With the court's permission, I'd like to read a brief excerpt dated the year she amended her will." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Evelyn opened to the marked page and began to read, her voice soft but clear. "Elena has grown into a woman of integrity, steady and fair. She understands responsibility. Daniel has not changed. I love him deeply, but I cannot entrust him with what I've built. Money in his hands becomes a weapon, not a tool. I pray he finds humility before he resents her for what I choose." Silence crashed over the room. My mother covered her mouth, eyes shining with something between hurt and denial. My father stared at the rail in front of him, like if he focused hard enough, the words would stop echoing. "Emotional ramblings," Gable said quickly, "not evidence of intent." The judge closed his eyes briefly, then looked up. "I disagree," he said quietly. "This is the voice of a lucid woman who understood both her assets and her family." As the testimony continued, every story my parents tried to tell seemed to fray at the edges under questioning. They had no proof of confusion, no examples of missed medications or lost words. They couldn't name the last birthday they had spent with her, the last time they had helped her with anything other than their own bills. By the time Evelyn finished her cross-examinations, the narrative they'd constructed had more holes than substance. Finally, after hours that felt like days, the judge leaned back, removed his glasses, and rubbed his temples. "I've heard enough," he said. "I'll return with my ruling shortly." He disappeared into chambers. The room exhaled, everyone shifting, whispering, fidgeting. My heart pounded against my ribs, not with triumph, not even with fear exactly, but with a strange, exhausted numbness. Evelyn touched my arm lightly. "Whatever happens," she murmured, "you honored her." Minutes ticked by. 5, 10, 15. When the judge returned, the room snapped back to attention. He sat, placed his glasses back on, and looked first at me, then at my parents, then at the file in front of him. After reviewing the testimony, medical records, financial documents, and the decedent's own written words, he began, "This court finds no evidence of undue influence or diminished capacity. The will of Margaret Lawson stands as written. All assets remain with Lieutenant Commander Elena Lawson." A murmur rippled through the gallery. My lungs finally remembered how to pull in air. Across the room, my mother sagged as if someone had cut a string, holding her upright. My father's face crumpled for a second before he forced it back into something harder, more familiar. The judge's gaze softened, just barely. "Justice," he said, almost to himself, "does not always follow blood. Sometimes it follows character." The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed through the courtroom like a door slamming shut and opening at the same time. I had won. Grandma's will was safe. Her trust in me had been upheld. And yet, as I stood there in that heavy quiet, looking at the two people who had brought me here, what settled deepest in my chest wasn't victory. It was a slow, aching question about what, if anything, could ever be rebuilt from the ruins left behind. The gavel's echo was still fading when the room emptied around me, like water draining from a basin. I remained seated, fingers pressed lightly against the table, trying to steady the tremor in my breath. Winning didn't feel like winning. It felt like standing in the wreckage of something that had already broken long before I ever entered that courtroom. My parents sat frozen for several seconds before finally rising. My mother's shoulders were rigid, her chin trembling as she gathered her purse with shaking hands. My father hesitated, looking down at the polished table as though the wood itself might give him a different answer if he stared long enough. They didn't speak to me. Not a whisper, not a word, not even the faintest nod to acknowledge that everything they had tried to take had never been theirs to begin with. They walked out, side by side, but not together, moving like two people bound by anger and shame rather than anything resembling love. When the doors closed behind them, the silence in the courtroom felt heavier than any verdict. Evelyn touched my shoulder gently. "You handled yourself with dignity," she said. "I don't feel dignified." "You don't have to. You just had to be truthful, and you were." Her reassurance barely reached me, but I appreciated the softness in her voice. She helped me gather my folders, and as she stepped away to make a quick call, I noticed Judge Hanover standing near his chamber door, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He approached slowly. "Lieutenant Commander," he said. "Yes, Your Honor." He paused, as if searching for the right tone. "I knew your grandmother," he finally said. "Years ago, she helped my wife during a difficult time with our first mortgage. Nothing dramatic, nothing big, just kindness. Your grandmother was the sort of woman who made quiet goodness seem like a natural thing." Warmth bloomed unexpectedly in my chest. "She never told me that," I said. "She wouldn't have," he replied. "She didn't help people for recognition. She helped because she believed in fairness." He studied me for a moment. "She would be proud of you." The words struck a chord so deep I had to look away to keep myself from breaking in front of him. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded once and returned to his chambers. Evelyn returned a moment later, squeezed my arm, and reminded me to call if I needed anything. Then she left too. And suddenly I was alone. The ride back to Grandma's house was quiet. Snow tapped lightly against the windshield as I drove through town. The steam from small restaurants curled into the sky. Christmas lights blinked lazily from storefront windows. And for the first time since her death, Maple Falls felt achingly empty. Inside the house, warmth wrapped around me. Not physical warmth, but the emotional kind that lived in memories. I walked into the living room and sank into her old armchair. The quilt she had sewn years before settled around my shoulders like an embrace I still wasn't ready to let go of. On the table beside me lay her diary, the leather softened by time. I picked it up and opened to the last page she had written. "Justice is not a fight, it is a way of living. May Elena carry this truth even when the world is unkind." I pressed my fingers to the paper, feeling the faint indentations left by her handwriting. "I'm trying," I whispered. "I promise I'm trying." A knock startled me, soft, hesitant, not the kind of knock that belonged to anger. I opened the door to find my father standing on the porch, snow gathering on his shoulders, his breath visible in the frigid air. He looked older than I remembered, not in years, but in regret. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I hesitated but stepped aside. He entered slowly, his gaze wandering over the familiar room he had rarely sat in over the years. His eyes landed on the family photos, the worn books, the old quilt on my lap. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I read her diary," he said softly, "the part the court allowed, and more, before the hearing." I froze. "You read it?" He nodded. "I shouldn't have, but I did, and I saw things I didn't want to see, things I'd avoided for years." There was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion. "I wasn't a good son," he said, voice cracking, "and I wasn't a good father to you. I don't have excuses. I just have the truth." I swallowed hard. "You hurt me." "I know," he whispered, "and I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for a chance to try again, to be someone you can at least talk to." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and fear, and something fragile I hadn't expected to feel. After a long moment, I nodded. Not big, just enough. His shoulders sagged with relief. He stayed only a few minutes more, then left quietly, as though afraid to disturb the house further. That small nod, my nod, wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing. It was the first stitch in something that had been torn for far too long. Over the next few days, the town buzzed softly with the news of the ruling. Neighbors stopped me at the grocery store to offer kindness. People who loved Grandma found me in aisles or on sidewalks to say that justice had been done. A young cashier pointed at the JAG insignia on my coat and said, "Thank you for your service," with a sincerity that nearly undid me. On the third morning after the hearing, as I stood outside with a mug of tea warming my hands, I heard footsteps crunching in the snow. My father again. He held a small worn box wrapped in old newspaper. "I found this," he said, holding it out. Inside was a Polaroid. My grandmother holding me as a baby, smiling with a joy I had never seen in any other photo. My father was in the background, younger, hopeful, before life bent him out of shape. "I thought you should have it," he said. This time the nod came easier. Later that night, my phone rang. My mother's name flashed on the screen. Her voice wavered when she spoke. "I heard your father visited," she said. "If you ever want to talk to me too someday, I'll wait." I wasn't ready, but I didn't hang up on her. The days blurred into small acts of rebuilding, repainting the porch railings, sweeping the walkway, organizing the shed the way Grandma would have approved. I planted bulbs in the frozen garden, tiny packages of hope waiting for spring. And every time I hammered a nail or wiped away dust, I whispered, "I'm doing my best, Grandma." The Navy reinstated me soon after, my record intact. My commanding officer shook my hand and said, "We're proud of you." But it was Grandma's voice I heard in my mind. Justice follows character. Now, to anyone listening to my story, if you've been abandoned, doubted, or betrayed, if you've had to defend your truth when others tried to rewrite it, if you've lost someone who held your world together, I hope my grandmother's legacy whispers this to you tonight. Justice is not a verdict. It's a way of living, a way of forgiving, a way of choosing truth even when it hurts. And if this story meant something to you, tell me where you're listening from. Share your own story, and if you want more, subscribe. 1 second for you, a world of difference for us.